Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome to this meeting of the Strategic Planning Subcommittee. July 21st, 2023. The Governor's Workforce Development Board Strategic Planning Subcommittee meeting. For the record, my name is Nancy Olson, Chair of the Strategic Planning Subcommittee. Katie, do you want to go ahead and take roll?
Sure thing. Okay, so we have Chair Olson.
Oh, here.
Councilman Black. Have Drazen Ellis.
Present.
Okay. Tommy White. Senator Lang. Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno. Sherry Mantanona. We have Vice Chair Estepona. Might not be on yet. Okay, we have Gina Bongiovi.
Here.
Michael Bolognini. Okay. Brett Miller.
Here.
Robert Fink. We have Mike Yoder.
Here.
Daniel McHatton.
Here.
Ariana Florence.
Here.
Okay. Milt Stewart.
Here.
David Schmidt. And then call Ed Estepona one more time. Looks like he just came in.
Here.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty. All right, Ms. Chair, Katie Gilbertson, Governor's Office Workforce Innovation for the record. I hereby affirm that this June 21st, 2023 Governor's Workforce Development Board meeting has reached a quorum. I further affirm that the agenda and notice for this meeting were properly posted pursuant to Nevada's open meeting law 241.020.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed, I would kindly request that anyone who speaks today identify themselves for the record. On to agenda item number 4, public comments. Members of the public are invited to provide comments at this time. No action may be taken on any matters during public comments until the matter itself has been included on the agenda as an item for possible action. Do we have any public comments on the telephone? Any public comments on Zoom? Okay, thank you. Can you see the slideshow?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm doing a very brief slideshow because of some information that I wanted to be visible as opposed to just reading it or anything like that. But before we get to that, agenda item number 5, is there any discussion before I call for a motion to approve the March 22, 2023 Strategic Planning Subcommittee meeting minutes? Okay, hearing no discussion, I call for a motion to approve the March 22, 2023 Strategic Planning Subcommittee meeting minutes.
Edward Estepona for the record, so move.
Second.
Thank you.
Drazen for the record, I second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, let the record reflect that that motion carries. We also have agenda item number 6, a motion to approve the March 31st, 2023 Strategic Planning Subcommittee meeting minutes. Is there any discussion before I call for motion to approve? Hearing no discussion, I call for a motion to approve the March 31st Strategic Planning Subcommittee meeting minutes. Do I have
Edward Estepona for the record, so move.
Thank you. Second?
Gina Bon Jovi for the record. Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Please let the record reflect that the motion carries. Okay, moving on to agenda item number 7 for discussion and informational only. I will provide some updates on the progress of the strategic planning work group towards drafting the state plan. Any work group members that are here today, I welcome you to join the discussion as needed or applicable. So the work group has been meeting roughly every 2 weeks. In addition to the meetings, we've had work group members who have volunteered to take different sections of the state plan and start working on a response that is a more cohesive system-wide response to the federal prompts. Whereas in the past, the state plan was written in such a way that each individual title and core partner responded to the prompt. And it was not, for the most part, a cohesive response from each. It was each of us doing our own thing, basically. So the work group is working on making some significant changes to each of the sections, or at least most of the sections that were addressed in that manner. In addition to that, the work group has been working on the goals within the plan, as well as strategies for each goal. And we will be talking more about the state plan goals. But I think we're progressing well. The time frame for this work is short. It's always short by the time it starts. But we need to have a rough draft, at least, of the state plan to go to the full board and then out for public comment, with the due date to the feds expected to be the first week in March of 2024. So that sounds like we have lots of time, but we do not. We've had a pretty active work group. And like I said, we've had, some volunteers within the work group. I'd like to publicly call out Brett Miller and Janice Klein and thank them for the work that they are doing and continue to do on the state plan. As well as, my colleague and right-hand person, Ariana Florence, who, really has helped with everything I do. So anyone want to add to the updates of the work group progress? And this might be a short meeting. We'll see. Okay. If no one wants to add to that, we will go to the next agenda item for possible action, based both on the discussion today, the work group's progress, and the goals that you see proposed on the slide. So the proposed goals, we looked at what was already in the state plan, and then we looked at what we thought was missing, and the targeting of those historically underserved, we felt was not that different core partners haven't targeted those, but there wasn't really a focus on that in the state plan in the past. And then the alignment, we have had language in the state plan forever that speaks to alignment, but not steps underneath that to really implement that alignment and have measures of that implementation. And same with collaboration. Carlene, yes, I see your hand.
So National Department of Labor was here last Friday, and they were telling us about the fact that the TIGA will be going out, and it's not going to have any surprises in it. But they did tell me that they need us to have more collaboration with registered apprenticeships. They said that is one thing they're going to be looking for in our state plan, and they did say they will be looking at the state plan. So I just wanted to give you that heads up. I hadn't had a chance to debrief you yet.
Thank you. And I will tell you that Janice and I had a conversation, was that just yesterday, Janice? And she mentioned that to me. So what I've done so far is just to put kind of a holding, place in the strategies underneath the goals.
Perfect.
Yeah. So we'll make sure that that is addressed. And Milt, I see your hand.
Yeah, I have a question which might be semantics, but targeting those historically underserved to decrease unemployment or increase employment? I mean,
Oh, you could put increase employment. It's more positive that way. Let me I stopped the screen sharing on purpose. Where's my screen sharing? There it is. Is it better?
well, I mean, I think it's up to the group, and if we're going to say that, then probably the grammar needs to change there. Increase employment and labor participation. Again, I leave that up to the group. I do want to have a conversation around KPIs and metrics based on what I think I heard during the governor's board meeting. Just let me know when that's appropriate.
Okay. So one of the things that I brought up in the Governor's Workforce Development Board meeting was that we wanted to be careful about adding measures to the state plan, because we could be held accountable to those same measures federally. And if we are found to not meet additional measures, then we could be subject to sanctions. So what I'm proposing is that when it comes to the hard and firm measurements of these outcomes, that we look at the separate 2 to 3 page implementation type documents to drive those measurements. So for those of you that maybe weren't on earlier meetings and heard, you know, didn't hear part of this conversation, Ken Evans, the vice chair, co-chair for the Governor's Workforce Development Board, has spoken at length during these meetings and other meetings about having a simplified document or even multiple documents that would pull out from the state plan specific strategies and measurements for implementation that could be used as a living document, as opposed to the 200 and some page state plan. So the state plan has to be, it has to be in compliance with the federal Department of Labor and Department of Education. However, we want to make it more of a strategic plan and less of a compliance document. So we are kind of going at it 2 different ways. And one is that the content of the state plan would improve to have a more strategic focus. But we would also have these separate documents, maybe 2 or 3, that would be 2 or 3 page documents that would pull out kind of the meat and potatoes of the state plan and have measurements attached to that. So for instance, if we are targeting those historically underserved, we might look at African-American males have an unemployment rate of some ungodly rate. It's like 20% or something like that. So we might look at, you know, one measure would be increasing the number of African-American males served in different titles. Or it could speak to, you know, actually decreasing the unemployment of a particular population, or increasing labor participation of a particular population. Those are not federal performance measures. The federal performance measures are based on overall, you know, how many people were employed 2nd quarter after exit and how many people were employed 4th quarter after exit, as well as median earnings and other measures. But they don't target into specifics like this for the federal measures. Yeah, Edward.
Edward Estepona for the record. So in just looking at like the first goal here, and again, based on measurements that we're talking about, it's very easy at this point to be able to say we want to increase participation, targeting those historically underserved, to increase employment and labor participation by 5%, by 10%. We're going to avoid those numbers there, and it's okay to avoid it here, right there, specifically, because again, I think you know, and looking at these goals, I mean, they're goals, but there's no measurement specific at all to any of these goals. That doesn't tell me specific. And so those specifics though, are they something that on our what I call our shortened plan, or, you know, the 2-3 pager that we're talking about, is that where we put those percentage and then put some maybe even within that sub goals that says to the African American population, you know, we need to do X amount of %, right? Is that what you're talking about specifically?
It is, and it might be, you know, we're talking about over time too. So for instance, initially a target for a historically underserved population might be setting a baseline, you know, like what's the current and what's the impact of a particular intervention, or you know, particular marketing, or you know, something to that effect. But yes, my thinking is that we set those goals, or we set those targets, I should say, outside of this.
Right.
Again, we set the federal targets within the state plan.
Right. And I again, I follow, and I'm in agreement with that. I certainly, like I said, in this whole process, my goal is not for us to get tripped up with the federal level. I think the federal level, they operate on their own world, but certainly on, you know, in our world, what we need to do, it'd be great to be able to have these goals and then have them attached to some sort of dashboard measurement so we can always track what we're doing, so that we're not coming back 3 years later and go, this was our goal, how did we do? I think it should be something that we could constantly look at and say, are we falling behind? Are we ahead of schedule? Because again, I think those are important things. Just as, you know, again, as a business, that's what we do. We have these dashboards that we look at on a regular basis for our own goals, and we're looking at them almost constantly to see if we're moving the needle or not moving the needle. And I think that's what I would like to see in this, because again, federal government, pull them aside, they are what they are, they do what they need to do to get the money out of them. But certainly from a state level, I want to make sure we're hitting on some key goals that has some accountability numbers, because that's the other thing too in this whole process. I think if we all collectively as a group decide these are the accountable numbers we're going to measure, one, you know, other people can't keep on adding new stuff, or they can try to add new stuff, but the reality is it's harder to add new stuff necessarily once you're on down a path. And what I don't like, and what I have seen, is that there isn't any clarity of what these KPIs are, because we're looking at number today, it's this number, tomorrow it's this number. I want to be consistent with whatever number and make sure that that's the expectation, and make sure that all the partners that are involved in helping affect those numbers, that they're all that they all have the same idea and thought of what that is, as opposed to some vagueness. And I just want to remove the vagueness, because I think that'll just make it easier for everybody to operate. I've been in those governor workforce meetings where these numbers are being asked, and I'm like, what numbers? I keep on asking myself. I'm a fairly new board member, but I'm like, what numbers? And that's what I want to avoid. I want to say, okay, if it's the numbers that are this specific number, then great. That is what we're going to look for. And then that even leads to the question is, can we attain those data right now? Do we have the tools to attain it? Because I don't want to put something that we don't have the data to, because that's already setting us up for failure. So again, that's just my own viewpoint on this. I think this is great what you guys have. I think these are great goals, to be honest with you. But I would like to get specific on our own little separate cheat sheet. We'll call it the Cliff Notes version of our strategic plan, because you know that's my generation. we saw the Cliff Notes instead of reading the novels. We read the Cliff Notes.
Yeah, and Milt, before I get to you, I will respond to Edward that the number one, we have data, we collect data, and we have access to data that I think would address this very, very well. So I don't think that having the data or having access to the data is a problem when it comes to this. Now,
I think that the challenge will be, again, when we start breaking out to specific race or specific gender or specific things. Again, I want to make sure we can collect those data, because I think, you know, we want to, in serving to underserved, we do have to look at the ones that are suffering the most, you know? And so again, as long as we can have that data, that's awesome. I love that if we have it already.
Yeah. And Milt, I saw you first, and then Carlene after Milt.
Yeah, I think I'm, you know, just gonna kind of echo what Edward was saying. And to sum up, can we measure, you know, these goals? Can we establish are we able to establish baselines? Are we able to measure or quantify what we're looking for as far as an increase in operational alignment of services? Like, I don't even know how you measure that. I don't know how you quantify that or improve collaboration between required partners. I don't know how you measure that either, whether it's referrals or co-enrollments or whatever. So I think that you know, those would be some of my questions. I do agree that it's, you know, when we talk about, excuse me, when we talk about employed second quarter after exit, employed fourth quarter after exit, those are called common measures, and they're called common measures for a reason, because the titles, that's information that's commonly collected amongst the titles, right? Generally speaking. And so, but that doesn't necessarily mean that some of this other data, this other information that we're collecting is as commonly collected. So I think that that's, you know, a variation of what Edward's saying, which is we collectively need to be mindful of, can we, you know, if we're establishing some type of KPI or metric, do we even have that data? Because, you know, Voc Rehab may collect something that Title I doesn't, and vice versa. And, you know, one title may say, yeah, I can provide that. And another title will say, there's just no way, we don't collect that information. And that doesn't mean it's impossible. It means that right now we're not able to do that. And so I think that we need to be mindful of that. The other question that I have is the idea here that these two to three pagers are literally developed in conjunction with and synchronously with the state plan, or is there time and space once the state plan is developed to really further dig into what that looks like? Yeah, I guess those are my questions.
So before I go to Carlene, let me respond. I would say there is time and space. I know that the leadership of the Governor's Workforce Board is especially anxious to have these 2 to 3 page documents, but I think that it only makes sense. And I know that Ken Evans said, you know, that he wants it done at the same time. But realistically, I don't know that that is an option. We could certainly, you know, if we agree on the goals and then we come back and we agree on the strategies, then we could certainly, because those 2 to 3 page documents are really going to focus in on the goals and the strategies. They're not going to focus in on, you know, all 150 other pages of stuff that the feds want necessarily.
Right, and there's no deadline to the feds for those 2 to 3 pagers, but there is a deadline for the state plan.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Okay, Carlene.
Trying to find the button. So for Title I and Title III, we do have that information, and if they are job ready, and Title IV has put in the information in their system, whatever they've put in their system will come into Employee NV, but it's only as good as our case managers. So we need to always keep that in mind. We can get the information, we can gather that information. We reported on the Pearl for Title I and Title III right now. But if they don't ask the question of race, ethnicity, sexuality, where it's only as good as the data entry that's done.
Very good point. Yeah. Yeah. Title II is the same way. We collect it all. We tell them they have to collect it all. But you're right. There's, you know, things that don't get. I'd like to think it was completely accurate, but let's be real. Okay, Jocelyn, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, just share a couple of things. So I think as we, as we've identified the underserved populations, I think we identified that off of the Dave's reports, right? The reports that the research and analysis units of data provides, and those are not necessarily those data points are collected through surveys, right? So they're essentially extrapolations of a very small number of folks that are surveyed. So they're not 100% accurate. And then we, on the other end, I guess, as we look at how are we going to address these things, and as kind of Edward asked about us essentially having more, to some extent, real-time data. So that way we will be looking at reports that are kind of more timely. All of the theaters, all of the ESDs or UMVR's report that we have, they're essentially like 2 to 4 months after things are happening. So I guess we would just have to reconcile some of that. I think as far as the kind of the alignment, how are we going to impact these particular populations when it comes to employment, we would possibly need to break down the data that Dave provided. So if you're talking about a particular segment of population that is underserved or underemployed, what particular area of the state, and not just saying southern or northern, but where in the southern Nevada, what part of North Las Vegas, or what zip codes you'll be looking at. So that way we can say that these are the activities that we would do to particularly focus in these areas to impact this population. And then we would still not be able to see like data happening in real time. Some of that will be kind of really down the road before we would kind of see what the results are. I'm not sure kind of how often Dave's team does their surveys. I think it's either on biennial or annual basis. So I guess as we would know whether the activities that we are doing are impacting employment or not, then it would take some time for us to do that. So I think we just need to kind of take that also into consideration, so that way we know when we would look for the data to be available in order for us to know whether the activities that we have done are actually leading to real-time results. Or real world results, I guess, not so real time.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree completely. One thing, that's one of the reasons why I was thinking that a baseline might be the first measure, is establishing a baseline, because we know that from Dave's data that as a state, we have really high unemployment for some populations, really low labor force participation for other populations. We don't know necessarily within each title, whether or not we are underserving, or if there are other factors, and we can't, you can't make a correlation. You could say correlation, not causation sometimes. So I think, one of the first things we might want to do as a measure is working on the baseline and then go from that into trend data. So you're right, it may be, we may have a new data point once a year to start with. So, and I saw Brett first, and then I'll go to Ken.
Brett Miller for the record. Yeah, I just want to echo with what everyone has said. And I mean, I think I see these proposed goals as being, these three as being high level, and possibly the strategies we implement may have numbers behind them. But I mean, just to look at, for example, the first one, if you're dealing with unemployment and you have roughly, let's say, 2 million individuals in the workforce and 5% unemployment, you're looking at 100,000 people, right? And so measuring the impact of our programs on that number is I think beyond our capabilities in more of a research question. So it would be very difficult for us to put specific goals associated with that sort of thing. But that being said, I think we can measure the strategies we'll put in place to support it.
Thank you, Brett. Ken?
Hello, Ken Goodrich for the record. Did I do that correctly?
You did, perfect.
Okay. So it seems like, when I look at these goals and I listen to the discussion by the other members, it seems to me that, we could really tighten this up and make the process a lot easier if we kind of stuck to what I've always used as a SMART goal system. So SMART meaning it's an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So if we took each of these three goals and made sure that each of these pieces were included in the goal, it would make it very easy to decide, because we will know what data we'll have, where we can access data for a goal, and whether we should make it a goal or not if we can't access the data, because the goal has to be measurable. So as I listen to this conversation, maybe tighten that up would give us directions on the next phase of the work. Does that make sense?
It does, and that was kind of my first thinking with the goals based on what was currently in the plan. My thinking was we need goals that are measurable. We need goals that, and I think I even used the SMART goals example. However, going back to the fact that this is in response to the federal requirements, I think that I, for one, am a little more comfortable with keeping the goals as more overarching, and then the strategies get more specific, and then that 2 to 3 page document we're talking about really gets into the SMART goals and really gets into the time frames and the measurements. The problem that, anything we put in the state plan, we can be, whatever you want to call it, held to with the U.S. Department of Labor and U.S. Department of Ed. With that in mind, we want goals that will help to drive the system improvement, but not put us at risk at the same time. Does that make sense, Ken?
Well, I'm just getting my feet wet here. I'm not familiar with the federal requirements and such, but
there are a lot.
Sounds like you've thought through it.
We have, and we've discussed it at length in multiple meetings. But you bring up very good points as far as that goes, because normally when you have goals, you want them to be SMART goals. This is kind of one of those things where we still want them to be SMART goals, but outside of the plan.
Okay.
But the strategies would get more specific. And we've done some work, Ariana and I, and in conversations with others, have done some work on the strategies. I wasn't ready to present those today, but they follow along with each of these overarching goals. So the agenda item today is whether or not we want to take a vote on whether or not these three overarching goals are what we want. Yeah, Milt.
So, excuse me, Milt Sewer for the record. So, I have been a part of those in the past. Have been a part of those working groups, and I know the hard work that is done in those groups. So I'm not going to question in any way, shape, or form how we got here, because I know that there's a lot of good people doing a lot of hard work to get us to there. So I would agree that if you all came to the conclusion that these would be the three goals, then I would support that. I also, Ken, I feel you, man. I feel it. It took me a long time, having come from business to getting involved in this, to government, to say, yeah, but we're kind of not saying anything here, right? We're not measuring, and we're not saying anything that's measurable in this goal. And if we, for a long time, and I'm sure Nevada's not the only state that looked at this state plan as more of a compliance document than really a strategic planning document. And as we transition to making this document really be more of a strategic planning document, there are still some vestiges of this compliance aspect that are really in our best interest to keep in, from a compliance perspective, keep it at that level in this state plan. But also, as we've been talking about, we'll pull out some of these things into a document that we can hold ourselves accountable. The state can hold itself accountable to, but the feds can't hold us to. And that allows us the space for a couple things. Number one, we can be innovative. We can change that as we're needed. This state plan, when it goes to the feds, it's a 4-year plan that gets updated in 2 years. Well, if the governor's board create something outside of the state plan, it can be modified whenever. And those metrics and goals can be modified based on what the governor's workforce development board wishes. So I feel what you're saying, but I agree with Nancy that to the extent that we're able to present that high level through the state plan and really the operational or implementation plan, if you will, through the strategic document externally, I think that, that's really the best approach.
So Nancy Olson for the record. I've brought up the document that we've been working on that includes the three goals and then the strategies that we've started on underneath those. Ariana, sent me a quick chat to say she thought that might help you guys wrap your head around, what we're trying to do.
Nancy, this is Edward Estepona for the record. I agree with what Milt is saying. I think that whatever the 2 to 3 pages or whatever that shortened version, that's what I call our real playbook, not the federal government's playbook, but our real playbook, they should at least at the minimum support these federal goals, but can have added goals that we do not want necessarily to put ourselves at risk from a federal level. For the same reason, like Milt said, the federal level, the speed is so slow, everything's slow, but the job market's changing so fast right now. That's why I think it's important to establish these data points and what can be captured and what isn't, and then even identify if we can't capture some of these data points, identify if there is a way to capture it, we just don't have the tools. And if we need the tools, then that is something that we have to go back to legislation for other groups or whatever to try to say why we need those tools so that we can have it for the future. I think you got to be a realist in approaching this. This is not, and I certainly approach it from a realist standpoint. I come from the business sector and I don't expect things to turn on a dime. And I do expect things to have a slowness to it, but I think there's a way to do it in a way that's logical and smart that sets us up to succeed. Because one of the things I realized that's going to come out of this is we do this once, the way we're doing it now process-wise, we'll have some sort of template or pathway to do it next time. And so we can keep on tweaking it to make it better for us. And eventually, you know, we're going to always just do whatever it takes from a federal government standpoint, but within the state, we're going to be operating in our own world, doing our own thing because we have a better game plan. So again, that's just my take on this. It's just, I do not have problems with these goals. I think these are all goals that if we did collectively improve all of these, you would improve the workforce system as a whole. Again, I'm kind of with Mill. I'm not quite sure how you're going to measure 2 and 3 at some point when we try to put that in the shorter term goals. Or in the shortened version goal that we're coming up with, but that's going to be probably the challenge in that. The number 1, that one's very easy to apply some sort of baseline numbers. Number 2 and 3, it'll be interesting how we do that.
Yeah, and you know, with number 2 and 3, my thinking for a lot of it is going to be, you know, an activity or a strategy being completed is the measure. So for instance, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, I've lost track, there was an asset mapping that was conducted. And, you know, theoretically, that asset mapping should have been able to be used to determine who was doing what and what they brought to the table, kind of thing. But that's back on here because that asset mapping that was done in the past was never used in that way. It kind of, I don't even know what happened to it, but it was done, and you know, several of us filled out our portions, and then I think it got stuck somewhere along the way. But that's, you know, an activity that it's not a number that we can put to it, but it's a check mark that we can say, you know, this was a necessary activity and it's done now.
So Nancy, if it is an activity, then that falls more on a tactic or a strategy and less of a goal. And to me, I guess that's how I differentiate goals. Goals tend to be something I can numerically align something to. And even with strategy, to some degree, you can put some numbers. Tactically, you know, that's exactly what you're saying. It's more tactical of we're going to do an asset map. And from that asset map, you know, your end goal still may be the same. So your tactic is you're going to do an asset map. And then the next tactic after that is to start connecting all of the different organizations based on those assets, how they have to play nice with each other and how they interrelate to each other, and doing the education part. And then what you can do from a goal standpoint is you can maybe say, okay, we're going to have series of this and we're going to have X amount of this to the point of, you know, all of these groups have been joined together, which creates some numerical numbers, because the numerical comes from how many groups we're talking about. Like, you know, what are these different organizations? So we could always establish that. But again, that's just the way I look at it, is that goals are things that I can attach a number to.
Yeah, and I get that, I do. I think part of it here is the way that the federal requirement here is part of it. Like for instance, here's in yellow, this is the federal prompt for part of this portion of the plan.
Nancy, not to interrupt, we can't see what you're showing. We just see the PowerPoint still.
Oh, you can't?
No.
You stop sharing and try again.
Yeah, just if you were referencing.
Oh, God. That's not making any sense whatsoever, is it then? Let's try that again. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see your document now.
Okay. Wow. So you didn't see any of the strategies or anything. Okay. So the federal prompt talks about, describe the goals for achieving this vision based on the analysis of the state's economic conditions, workforce, and workforce development activities. And, it must include the goals for preparing an educated skilled workforce. It must include goals for meeting the skilled workforce needs of employers. So the goals, here are in response to that. And then what we've done, whoops, okay. So here's down to the first one, the population, and then some of the strategies that we've started working on underneath that. And then the measures are started there as well. And we just sat down and did some brainstorming to come up with the strategies based on, discussions the work group has had, as well as just from Ariana and I brainstorming.
So Nancy, this is Edward Espona for the record. So when I look at goals 2 and 3, from going back to that slide that you had beforehand, would it make sense to just have one singular goal, which is, again, increasing employment and labor participation from those underserved? And then at the end of the day, goal 2 and 3 is part of how we go about solving the big goal, which is unemployment or increasing employment. In other words, by, one of the tactics that we do is by creating stronger partnerships within the groups that are working within the sphere. Are we able to, because that's the end goal ultimately by all of this, is to increase labor. I mean, I think every state, that's probably the #1 goal, is increase labor participation as a whole. And so if that's the singular goal, it makes it much easier to say, how do we do that? And then, yes, part of that is through outreach, part of it is through greater, stronger partnerships, creating stronger measurement systems and all this other stuff. But I think the only goal that, to me, that was measurable that we can even put back in that 2 to 3 page plan is the #1. Because the others are more tactically driven of how we're going to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to have just one goal? Is it a mandatory we have to have 3?
It's not mandatory. I mean, like, they don't say exactly, but they do. They do talk about it in plural goals.
So then if there's 2, and then again, this is just me thinking out loud. It's like, so one goal is to underserve. The other, in addition to that, and I don't know, again, it's that whole thing that, in that section 8, the one right now that you have is what is, what do we define as underserved? Like, if I can boil it down, and underserved becomes everybody at some point, technically. So underserved could be obviously race, underserved could be gender. Those are the obvious, but then the age is another way you could look at underserved. So do we want to pull out specifically, even within that underserved, a section that to call out? Like, for instance, one of the challenges you're going to have is you're going to have some workers that are in their 50s that, because of technology and other things, that they're going to be placed out of market from a job standpoint. and they're, they could be a white male at that point. But so do we start creating goals around that? So that, again, that it's this measurable outcome is that what we're trying to look. And again, I'm not trying to be difficult with this at all. I mean, I'll go with whatever everybody else says. I mean, from the federal plan, that's fine. I just want to make sure that in my mind, when I think about that 2 to 3 pager, that I've got something that I can sink my teeth into, that again, there are data that we are consistent with, and that's important to, moving the needle where we want it to go.
Yeah, and I see, Nancy Olson for the record, I see the 2 to 3 pager type thing, pulling the overarching goal, but then splitting that, narrowing it in focus so that you might have 3 goals that stem from that overarching goal to say, so the populations that David Schmidt talked about were African-American males, I think at a certain age, single mothers, and people with disabilities. And so the overarching goal is the, historically underserved, all that. But the 2 to 3 page document might include a specific goal for single mothers, or a specific goal for, an age group, or, something to that effect, or a specific barrier to employment. So that's kind of the way that I'm seeing it in my head.
Okay. Well, Edward, that's one for record. At this point, I'm okay moving forward with these goals that you have and then developing strategy. I think the big question is going to be, when do we do, and again, I'm just hearing Ken Evans and Hugh Anderson's voices in my head right now, and they're like, when am I going to get this? That is what's going to come out of them. And so I think part of what would be good is, because I'm thinking about this chicken and egg kind of thing, because you can do all of the federal stuff first and then come back and tackle the 2 3 pager. But could some of the if you're working on them in tandem, could some of the things in the 2 3 pager affect what you do on a federal standpoint from a strategy and tactical standpoint on the plan?
Ultimately, I would say yes, but I think it might be in the next round of the state plan because of the time constraints that we have. Got it.
And then may I then suggest then at this point that rather than going through what we call the normal cycle of waiting when this is going to happen, is that once we have both plans created, at this point, we're just automatically updating things on the state plan for the future as we go, as opposed to trying to do it all at once like we're doing now. That way, you're not behind the 8 ball.
Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't allow that. No, they do, but there's a long process of review and approval.
Got it.
The submission of the state plan isn't as simple as just emailing it to somebody. So unless you have a significant substantive change in the state plan, then you would do changes every 2 years. Basically.
Okay.
Brett,
that's all I've got.
Brett,
I'm good, Nancy.
You're good. Okay.
Do we want, Nancy, Edward, that's one for the record, do we want to at this point have someone come forward to make a motion to adopt the proposed goals at this point?
I'd be happy with that, but I did see Droslin's hand.
Yeah, just briefly, so I guess the goals that that the governor's workforce development board, like that 2-page sheet, are we thinking that would be developed after the state plan is approved? Because if that's the case, you probably won't see that until like mid next year, because the state plan is not going to be approved until mid next year. So it's kind of, so it maybe, you know, I guess to some extent, I think it's a good point that possibly we would like to develop that ahead of time, and then based on that 2-page report, then write this plan, but at least we have something to go off of. But then again, it's, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. So
the 2 or 3 page document, the nice thing is that yes, we want it to work in conjunction with the state plan, but the bottom line is it doesn't have to be, it can have significant differences, put it that way, because it is just an internal, you know, state document. I think it's best if it, you know, connects and pulls from the state plan. But you're right, the state plan won't be approved until, you know, maybe when it May or June of, maybe as late as May or June of 24.
Right. So, I mean, that's kind of meaning that the current Governor's Workforce Development Board mandate would end by the time we get them to the plan.
Yeah. So Edward Estepona for record, if I may make a suggestion, Nancy, I think at this point, if you've got your goals and you've got your strategy, which it seems like you guys are getting closer to that strategy being done for the state plan, I think I would suggest that based on those goals and strategy, we can even splinter off to another small group that will actually work on that 2 to 3 pager and then come back together and kind of see how it keeps on aligning. And we may at some point, that 2 or 3 pager may actually be in action way before the state plan's approved, but at least we get things moving. And it certainly doesn't hurt us, because if things have to be altered or changed later on in that state plan that we have to do into the 2-3 pager, it's such a small document, it's not going to throw us off a whole lot. I just think at this point it gives us a working plan rather than waiting. Again, I'm channeling Hugh and Ken's voices in my head right now, because I sit on that board with them, and I just don't want anybody in this group to get assaulted at why is this not happening kind of thing. I'm like, okay, let's get this moving forward. Understanding, again, in business, we will pivot how we need to pivot based on what has to happen on the official. We know the state plan is the official plan, but we still need, as a governing board, a plan that we need to start acting and moving towards now. We're just behind. It's just not the perfect position to be in, but that's where we're in. So we just got to pivot and just figure out how to be most efficient with it.
And I like the idea of having a second work group. The work groups are not subject to open meeting laws because they are not decision-making bodies. They're actually work groups. So we could have a second work group. I don't want necessarily to have a work group consisting of those, you know, starting from scratch. So I would prefer to have some people that have been involved in the subcommittee or the work group that exists to be on that. But, and I don't think we need, we probably, well, so we don't have anything on the agenda about establishing another work group, which means we probably need to have another subcommittee meeting to make it official to establish another work group.
Yeah. So Edward, it's on a record. So yes, at this point, we at least need to acknowledge that we're going to put it on the next meeting agenda, which it's fine anyway where you're at, because again, if we're waiting for you guys to do strategy, we're going to be actually ahead to understand what we're doing with that group. So let's go ahead and kind of think through that, because again, you guys are in the process of doing the strategy portion now, which is great. Because I think, again, as long as the goals and strategy are there, then the second work group can try to create that playbook based off of that goals and strategy that you've got on the state plan. So I think we're in a good place, Nancy, to just, like I said, maybe just put it on the agenda for the next meeting for approval. But in the meantime, I think for this portion that you're trying to do, I would just say, let's get the approval of the goals that you put in front of us. That's the least that we can do today at this point.
I like it. Okay. Nancy Olson for the record. And so I'm going to ask, is there any further discussion before I call for a motion to approve the goals, these 3 goals of the state plan? Okay, hearing no further discussion, I call for a motion to approve.
This is Edward Estepona for the record. I so move.
Okay.
Now for the record, a second.
Thank you, Drazen. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, please let the record reflect that the motion carries. Before moving on, I would kindly request that any member of the subcommittee who arrived late after roll call was taken to please identify yourselves at this time so you're marked present.
Katie, you got me right. This is Edward Estepona. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to agenda item number 9. Members of the public are invited for final comments. Do we have any comments on the telephone? Any on Zoom? Okay, hearing no further comments, I hereby move to adjourn this meeting. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, guys.
Yep.